I can still clearly hear the sound of that pen hitting the paper. It wasn't anything special. It was just so ordinary compared to everything else happening around me. It was a sound so small it should been swallowed up by that cramped marriage registry office, where the fluorescent lights made every face look pale and every stare feel way too intense. My name was already there on the bottom line, Elena Voss. It was printed perfectly, without a hint of a tremble or hesitation, just like the rest of my life had been laid out for me. All I had to do was sign my name to confirm I was willing to keep walking the path that had already been paved. I didn't look back, but I knew how many eyes were on me. They weren't curious. They were judging. It was that heavy silence from people who think they know your story better than you do. People who were sure they knew exactly what I was throwing away. The man sitting across from me didn't say a word. He wore an old jacket with slightly frayed cuffs. His shoes weren't dirty, but they weren't new either. Yet, the way he sat, back straight, hands resting calmly on the table, didn't look like someone entering a deal that everyone in the room thought was completely one-sided. I signed my name. I didn't slow down, didn't pause halfway through, and I didn't reread the words above. I learned early on that reading things carefully only makes the decision hurt more. It doesn't change a thing. The moment the tip of the pen left the paper, a faint vibration buzzed. Then another, and another. In just a few seconds, the whole room started moving in a strange way. Like an invisible wind had just swept through. Everyone reached into their pockets at once. The glow from their phone screens lit up their faces, and their expressions shifted, from indifference to focus, and then from focus to sheer confusion. Someone standing near the door whispered, quiet enough that you'd think no one heard, but clear enough to cut through the air. Who the hell just moved the market? I didn't pull out my phone. It wasn't because I wasn't curious, but because this strange feeling was holding me back. An instinct, not logic, telling me that if I looked at that screen, I'd understand what was happening. And once I understood, there would be no going back. Instead, I looked at the man beside me. He'd finished signing. I hadn't even noticed. He put the pen down so quietly it barely made a sound, then used 2 fingers to cap it, a simple, slow, unhurried gesture. It was as if everything around us, the vibrating phones, the shifting stares, the numbers crashing or soaring out there, had absolutely nothing to do with him. When he looked up, our eyes met for a brief second. No scrutiny, no explanation, just a gaze so impossibly calm it was unsettling. Like a man who already knew everything would unfold exactly like this. And in that moment, a thought flashed through my mind, vague and incomplete, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I didn't know who I'd just married. And what's more terrifying, I started to suspect that no one in this room really knew either. That afternoon started like every other afternoon in the house where I grew up. Quiet, tidy, everything in its place. Sometimes I felt like if I stood even slightly off-center, the whole room would adjust itself just to put me back where I belonged. My father called me into his office. He never called twice. That room always smelled of wood polish and old paper, the kind of scent that makes you think of things kept longer than they should be, of decisions made long before you even walked through the door. He didn't ask me to sit. He didn't beat around the bush either. The company won't survive the quarter. He said it like he was just reading an audited report. No raised voice, no emphasis, no room for emotion. I stood still. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood all too well. For the past 3 months, I'd seen those numbers before they were even spoken. Debts hidden through restructuring, contracts signed just to buy more time, decisions everyone knew were wrong but were made anyway because there were no other options left. 6 weeks at most, he continued, his eyes never leaving the folder in front of him. After that, we lose control. He always used that word with surgical precision. I took a breath, slow and steady enough to keep my voice from shaking. And what's the solution? He flipped to another page, set it on the desk, and slid it toward me. A familiar gesture, like when he first taught me how to read financial statements at 16. "There's a man," he said. "He's willing to step in." I looked down at the paper. It wasn't a figure, it wasn't a contract, it was just a name. Adrian Locke. I looked up, and in return, there was a very brief pause. "Barely there at all. You are going to marry him." His voice didn't waver for a second when he said it. He didn't wait for a reaction or look for a sign of protest, as if he were simply announcing the next logical step in a plan that had already been finalized. I didn't react right away. It wasn't because I was calm. It was just that split second where your brain refuses to process information, like it needs more time to decide if what you just heard was even real. "I am not an asset," I said, my voice remaining steady, which actually surprised me. He looked at me for the first time. Not with anger, not even with irritation. Just a look that was incredibly precise and incredibly cold. "No," he said, "but you're the only person who can keep all of this from falling apart." He gestured slightly toward the window, looking out over the city, the skyline, the offices, all those people working inside a system that I understood better than anyone. "Do you have any idea how many people depend on this company?" He wasn't asking a question. He was giving me a reminder. "It's not just the payroll," he continued. "It's their health insurance, their children's tuition, their mortgages, everything they've built over the last 10 or 20 years. He paused, ever so slightly. "And you know exactly what happens when all of that disappears." I knew. That was the problem. I knew it too well to even pretend I didn't understand. "Why him?" I asked. "Because that was his request," my father replied, "and because this is the only way." "Who is he?" "That's not important." That answer was the thing that finally made me realize. Not because he wasn't important, but because to my father, asking who he is was completely irrelevant once the outcome had already been decided. "Do I have a choice?" I asked. This time, he didn't answer immediately. He closed the folder, placed his hands flat on the desk, and looked me straight in the eye. For the first time, a flicker of something resembling emotion crossed his face. Not a softening, but a hardening of his resolve. "This is not a choice for you," he said. A pause. "This is your responsibility." His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't coercion in the way people usually think of it. It was simple, clinical, and left absolutely no room for argument. And because of that, it didn't leave me any room to fight back. I wasn't angry. That came later. In that moment, what I felt was like standing in a sealed room, realizing the air is slowly thinning out, not fast enough to make you panic, just enough for you to understand it's all going to end this way, and there's nothing you can do to change it. I nodded, not in agreement, but in acceptance. There's a massive difference between the two, and I think my father knew that. But he didn't need my agreement. He just needed me not to say no. When I turned to leave the room, my hands were steady, my pace was even, and everything on the outside seemed normal, but somewhere deep inside, something had stopped. It didn't break. It didn't hurt. It just wasn't moving anymore. And for the first time in years, I realized something I'd never considered before. I wasn't choosing my life. I was just following through on a decision made long before I ever had a say in the matter. The house wasn't small in a physical sense, but it was small in a way that pulled everything closer than I was used to. The living room and kitchen were only a few steps apart. The wooden stairs creaked softly whenever someone walked up, and the morning light didn't filter through grand glass or thick curtains. It just came straight in, natural and uninvited. I stood at the entrance on that first morning, suitcase still packed, looking at the space with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not hate, not fear, but more like you're standing in a place that wasn't designed for you, where everything works on a different logic you don't yet understand. The smell of coffee was already in the air. Not the expensive kind I was used to, with hints of caramel or complex notes. It was just coffee. Dark, a bit bitter, very straightforward. Adrian was already awake. I didn't hear him move. I just knew he was there when I walked into the kitchen, his back to me, wearing an old t-shirt with the sleeves rolled up, cracking eggs into a pan. He didn't turn around immediately. "Coffee's on the left," he said, as if he already knew I'd be standing there. I looked where he pointed. A simple mug, no logo, no special design, sitting next to the pot already poured. I didn't say thank you. I didn't ask either. Just walked over, picked it up, and took a small sip. It was hotter than I expected. "Careful," he said, very softly. Not a warning, just a word placed exactly where it needed to be. I nodded, even though he wasn't looking. A small set of footsteps came from the stairs. Maya appeared, her hair a mess, wearing pajamas with a blue whale on them. Her eyes were still heavy with sleep, but her mouth was already moving before her feet even hit the last step. "Dad, I had a dream that I was in the ocean, but I could breathe, and there was this fish that—" She stopped when she saw me. No fear, no shyness. Just pausing to process the new information. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied. Maya looked at me for a moment, very directly. No judgment, just observing. "Do you eat eggs?" the little girl asked. "I do," I replied. "Good," she nodded, as if she had just confirmed a vital piece of data. Adrian placed a plate of eggs and toast on the table. He pulled out a chair for Maya first, and then he sat down. He didn't bother with another introduction. He didn't try to force the mood. Everything felt as though I were just a new component added to a system that had been running for a long time. I sat down. The chair was a bit lower than I was used to. The dining table wasn't large. We were sitting close enough to hear every clink of a spoon against a plate. Maya talked through the entire breakfast, about a dream she had, about a glowing fish, about how she was certain there were still things at the bottom of the ocean that no one had found yet. Adrian answered every single question. He didn't rush her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lecture. He just asked questions back, letting Maya keep the story going. I ate my food. I didn't join the conversation, but I listened, and it bothered me more than I thought it would. It wasn't because they were loud. It was because they were real. There was no distance between them, no roles being played, none of the calculation I'd grown used to at every meal for years. After breakfast, Adrian cleared the table. It wasn't the kind of cleaning where you just want to get it over with. He did every task slowly and neatly, as if it were a natural part of his day rather than a chore. I stood by the kitchen door, watching him. "Where do you work?" I asked. "Nearby," he said. "Doing what?" He placed the last plate into the sink. "Fixing things that need fixing," he replied. I waited for more. He didn't say another word. The conversation ended right there. The days that followed passed in a rhythm I wasn't familiar with, but I couldn't exactly call it unpleasant. It was like listening to a song you don't really like, but you don't have a good enough reason to turn it off. There was always coffee in the morning. There was always someone cooking dinner. And Maya was always asking questions. Questions with no agenda but understanding. One time, I was working at the dining table, laptop open, one earbud out, and Maya was sitting across from me, drawing something that looked like a jellyfish but with extra legs. She was looking at me for longer than usual. I didn't notice at first, until she asked, "Do you always look like you're about to leave?" I looked up. "What?" "You look like you're not staying," Maya said, matter-of-factly, as if she were just describing the weather. "Like, your face is here, but the rest of you is already somewhere else." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood all too well. How long had I been looking that way? In meetings, during dinners, in every space where I've never felt like I belonged. Adrian didn't step in. He was standing by the sink, but I knew he heard. And he didn't say a word. His silence left her question hanging there, inescapable. "I was just thinking," I said. Maya tilted her head. "About leaving?" The question wasn't an accusation. It wasn't blame. It was just accurate. I looked down at the table. My fingers were resting on my laptop, but I couldn't remember what I'd been doing just a moment before. There was a brief silence. It wasn't awkward, but it was long enough for a thought to take shape. For what felt like the first time, I didn't know the right thing to say. "Maybe," I said. Maya nodded, as if a thought had just been confirmed. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing. The conversation was over. But the question didn't go away. It lingered. Not loudly, not demanding an answer, just there, in the back of my mind through everything I did over the next few days. And for the first time since I'd set foot in this house, I started to realize something very simple but deeply unsettling. I wasn't the only one who was watching. There's something I learned early on in my line of work. That feeling you get when something looks fine on the surface, but feels wrong the longer you look at it. Not obviously wrong. It just doesn't add up, like a number in the wrong column, an unspoken assumption, a detail too small to notice, but too present to ignore. I started to get that feeling about Adrian around the third week. At first, it was quiet, almost unnoticeable. Yet one morning, I was at the dining table, laptop open, on a call with an old client, trying to explain why a real estate deal they were considering looked good on the surface, but wasn't sustainable. I was talking about cap rates, about projecting cash flow over the next 3 years, about how one small deviation in an assumption could bring the whole structure down. I don't know how long Adrian had been standing in the kitchen. I only realized it when the call ended, when I took off my headset and heard the sound of running water behind me. That rate won't hold if they're banking on rental growth, he said, without turning around. If the cost of capital ticks up even slightly, they'll have to restructure within 18 months. I turned to look at him. He was still washing a mug, not looking at me, not waiting for a reaction, just said his piece and went back to what he was doing. I'd heard assessments like that before, from fund managers, from people who'd spent their entire careers reading the market, not from a guy who said he fixes what's broken. "Where did you read that?" I asked. He turned off the tap, dried his hands on a small towel. "Around," he said. The answer was too simple, too neat, and it meant absolutely nothing. I didn't press him. But the feeling stayed. It didn't get bigger, just sharper. 2 days later, I came home earlier than usual. No particular reason. Just a canceled meeting. The house was quiet. Maya was still at school. I walked into the hall and heard Adrian's voice. He was on the phone. His voice was low, even, unhurried. Didn't mean to listen in, but there are some words you can't unhear once you understand them. "Don't move it yet." A pause. Not until I say. I froze. Not on purpose. My body just froze before my mind could catch up. "No, that deal isn't clean," he continued. "The risk is being undervalued. They're hiding some of the debt." I couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying. I just saw Adrian tilt his head slightly, as if considering something. "Walk away," he said. No hesitation, no further discussion, just a decision. He ended the call as I walked in. He wasn't startled, offered no explanation. He just looked at me, as if my standing there was a normal part of the afternoon. "Work?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied, nothing more. He walked past me into the bedroom, changed his shirt, and then left the house a few minutes later as if nothing had happened. I stood alone in the hallway. The words he had just spoken were still hanging there, not the content, but the way he said them, the way a person speaks when they're used to making decisions without having to convince anyone, the way a person speaks when they know their word will be carried out. That night I started searching. Not for his name. I didn't have enough to go on yet. I searched for the deal he had mentioned. The mid-sized logistics company was in talks to be acquired. 3 days later, the buyer pulled out. There was no official announcement. The deal just vanished. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It could have been a coincidence, maybe, but in my line of work, coincidence is a word that rarely exists. The cracks started to show more clearly after that. Small, scattered, but they didn't disappear. A strange car parked in front of our house twice in 1 week. No one got out, no one knocked. It just sat there long enough to be noticed, then left. The man came to the door one afternoon, said he was at the wrong address, but his eyes weren't mistaken at all. One time, I saw Adrian receive an envelope with no return address, just his name written by hand, and he put it in a drawer without opening it right away. I started putting the pieces together, not quickly, not in a rush, but it was systematic. And for the first time, I wasn't just observing. I started to form a theory. If you weren't who you said you were, then who were you? And more importantly, what were you here for? I thought about my father, about the company, about how everything fell into place so neatly, so conveniently when I agreed to this marriage. I thought about Adrian showing up at just the right moment, about how he never needed to explain himself, about how he always knew. A straight line began to form in my head. It wasn't perfect, but it was logical enough. If someone wanted to control a vulnerable company, the best way isn't to attack from the outside. It's to get on the inside, as close as possible. I stood in the kitchen that night, watching him help Maya with her homework, crouched down to her level, patiently explaining a simple math problem as if it were the most important thing in the world. He smiled when Maya got the answer wrong. A small smile, not forced, not an act. Maya smiled back, completely trusting. And right then, a very unsettling thought entered my mind. What if all of this was just part of the plan? What if that kindness wasn't his nature but a tool? I didn't say anything. I didn't ask. But the way I looked at him changed from that day on. It was no longer just observation. It was assessment. And for the first time since I'd walked into this house, I felt something familiar return. My guard. Not because I knew for sure what was happening, but because I believed I was starting to understand. And what I understood didn't put my mind at ease. It made me more certain of only one thing. The man I married, he's not simple, and if I'm right, then I might have walked into something far more dangerous than my father ever let on. I didn't find the whole truth, just found enough to believe I understood. And that's always the most dangerous moment for people who live by logic, because once you have enough facts to build a conclusion that sounds reasonable, you stop looking for the things that could shatter it. For 3 straight days, I sat in front of the screen almost nonstop, not searching for Adrian's name, but tracing the movements he'd accidentally revealed through short remarks, decisions made as if he didn't even have to think. And slowly, tiny pieces started to connect. Not clearly, not directly, but enough to form a structure. An undisclosed investment network. No single name attached to it. No simple ownership structure for anyone to easily decipher. But it would appear at just the right time, repeating a familiar pattern, intervening at the exact moments a major deal was about to change direction, and then vanishing before anyone could even point out it was there. I stared at those movements for so long that I couldn't tell what was data and what was assumption anymore. And then I stopped, not because I was certain, but because I believed enough to act. That night, after Maya was asleep and the house fell silent in a way that made every small sound sharp and clear, I walked into the kitchen where Adrian was standing with his back to me, pouring water into a glass as if it were just another normal evening, as if nothing was slowly crumbling inside my head. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn around right away. He just set the glass down before turning to face me, his gaze as calm as ever, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I didn't waste any time. "You're not poor," I said, each word falling out clear and certain. "You're just playing a part." The silence fell between us. Not long, but long enough for me to feel my heart clench, like I'd just crossed a line I could never go back from. Adrian didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just looked at me for a long time, not looking away, not explaining, and it was his silence that convinced me I'd hit the mark. "I've seen how the system works," I continued, not giving myself a chance to stop. The cash flows, the decisions, the deals redirected at just the right time. He tilted his head slightly, as if he wasn't considering what I was saying, but how I'd reached that conclusion. "I don't care how much money you have," I said, feeling a surge of frustration at his persistent calm. "I care what you're doing to my family." That sentence changed the air between us. It was subtle but clear, like a hairline crack appearing on a surface that had seemed perfectly intact. "What do you think I'm doing?" he asked. His voice hadn't changed at all, not defensive, not argumentative, just a simple, well-placed question. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I think you're doing what people like you always do, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully. Approach the weakest point, get inside, and take control without anyone realizing it. I paused for a second, just long enough to hear myself. This marriage, I continued, wasn't a coincidence. Adrian didn't interrupt. He didn't cut in. That just made me keep going, a little faster now, as if I needed to finish my argument before he could break it apart. You showed up at the right time, you knew too much, and you never explained anything, I said. Did you think I wouldn't notice? The silence fell between us. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to make everything clearer than it needed to be. Adrian looked down for a brief moment, then looked back up at me. I can explain, he said. Then explain. I shot back, leaving no space between us. He looked at me, longer this time, as if he were making a decision that had no perfect outcome. But if I did, he said slowly, you wouldn't believe me. I felt a wave of frustration rise, not because he was wrong, but because a part of me knew he might be right. You're avoiding the question, I said. No, he replied, very softly. I'm choosing not to give you a comfortable lie. That sentence made me pause, but not for long enough to change course. I don't need comfortable, I said. I need the truth. He watched me for a long time. The distance wasn't there like before, but he didn't get any closer either. Just a presence so absolute I couldn't ignore it. I'm not who you think I am, he said. I know, I replied instantly. But you're not entirely wrong about me, either, he continued. That made my jaw clench, because it wasn't a denial and it wasn't a confirmation. It just made everything murkier. Then say it, I said, my voice dropping low. He was silent for a second. Then he said it, slowly, clearly, without trying to persuade or justify himself. If you need a bad guy to make sense of this, then let it be me. The words weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, but they landed between us like something that could never be taken back. He didn't deny it, he didn't defend himself, he didn't try to pull me to his side. He just accepted the role I had just cast him in, and that, in an infuriating way, made me even more convinced that I was right. I don't need you to play that role, I said. But you've already cast me, he replied. His voice was still calm, but there was something very small retracting behind it. Not anger, not obvious hurt. Just a step back so subtle you would miss it if you weren't looking closely. What are you going to do next? He asked. I didn't answer right away, but I'd had the answer before I even stepped into this kitchen. I'm going to talk to my father, I said. He nodded. Just once. Fine. No trying to stop me. No trying to convince me otherwise. No asking again. It bothered me more than any other reaction could have. I'm not doing this because of you, I said. I'm doing it for the company. I know, he said. And that was it. I left the kitchen immediately after, not turning back, not looking at him again, but as my hand touched the banister of the stairs, I realized something I wasn't ready to face. I wasn't sure that I was right. I was only sure that I had gone too far to turn back and choose differently. And sometimes the most dangerous mistake isn't when you don't know you're wrong. It's when you believe you're right. Enough to keep going. Things don't collapse in a single moment. It begins with small, almost invisible shifts. The kind of things that if you're not paying close attention, you'd mistake for static, for the normal vibrations of a system used to operating under pressure. That morning, I was woken up by my phone. Not one call, many calls, back to back, nonstop. The caller ID kept changing. The lawyer, the CFO, a board member I'd only spoken to twice in the last 6 months. Before I could even answer, the text messages started pouring in. Links, headlines, screenshots. I opened one, then another, and in less than 2 minutes, I understood. Leonard K. doesn't do frontal assaults. He opened every front at once. The first article went live at 6:12 a.m. A long, skillfully written piece of analysis that didn't make any direct claims, but raised enough questions to make any reader suspicious. About the company's financial structure, about recent investments, about opaque decisions made in a short period of time. 30 minutes later, another article appeared. This time, it wasn't analysis. It was an accusation. A small group of shareholders announced they were considering legal action related to a breach of fiduciary duty. By 7 o'clock, a larger news agency had picked up the story, and from there, it just spread, not quickly, but unstoppably. I sat on the bed, phone still in my hand, as that familiar feeling came back. The feeling of watching a system begin to fracture from the inside, point by point, exactly the way it was designed to. I got up, threw on a shirt, and went down to the kitchen. Adrian was already there, like every morning. The coffee was poured, the light was the same. Everything was the same, except the world outside was shifting. "I assume you've seen," he said. He didn't turn around. I set my phone down on the table. The screen was still on. The words were still there. "He's making his move," I said. "Yeah," Adrian replied. That was it. No surprise. No follow-up questions. It bothered me. "You knew this was going to happen?" I asked. He turned, looked at me for a second, then gave a slight shake of his head. "I knew a man like him would never stop," he said. No further explanation. He didn't say his name, but I knew who he meant. Phone buzzed again. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I answered. The lawyer on the other end wasn't panicking, but his voice was faster than usual. Each sentence pushed out as if he were trying to keep everything from slipping through his fingers. "You have a problem," he said. "Some of the shareholders are being approached directly. They're being told that if they don't act now, they'll lose their entire investment." "I'll call them," I said. "Not fast enough," he replied. "They already have materials." I was silent for a second, long enough to understand. This wasn't a reaction. This was a planned attack. I hung up. I looked at Adrian. "He's applying pressure from all sides," I said. "The media to create a narrative, the shareholders for leverage, and the legal system to block any escape." Adrian nodded, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Aren't you going to do anything?" I asked. He looked at me, not for long, but long enough for me to feel like the question wasn't entirely fair. "You already are," he said. His answer made me pause. I didn't have time to process it. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was my father. I already knew what his voice would sound like. Not panicked, not out of control, just sharper. "Where are you?" he asked the moment I picked up. "At home. Have you seen it?" "Yes." A very brief pause. "Have you spoken to him?" I looked at Adrian. He wasn't looking at me. He was placing another plate on the table, as if this were just a normal morning. "Yes," I said. And that man didn't deny it. I don't know why I called him that. That man, not my husband. My father was silent for a second. "Good," he said. "Then you know what you have to do." Didn't answer right away. "Don't let your emotions slow you down," he continued. "This is the time to be on the right side of this." The call ended. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if I needed anything. Just giving orders. I put my phone down. I looked at Adrian. Then I looked away. Maya came down the stairs right at that moment, as if the outside world didn't exist. Her hair still messy, her shirt crooked, carrying the energy of a child who doesn't understand that the world can change in just a few hours. "Why are both of you so quiet?" she asked, looking from me to Adrian. No one answered right away. She walked over to the table, climbed onto her chair, and peered at my phone, where the screen was still lit up with a massive headline. She didn't understand all of it, but she was smart enough to feel it. "Are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice slowing a little, as if she were putting the words together herself. "Or are the adults just pretending again?" The question wasn't loud, it wasn't hard, but it hit a place I wasn't prepared for. I opened my mouth, and then I stopped. I had 100 answers for the shareholders, dozens of scripts for the press, a complete framework for crisis management, model, but I didn't have a simple answer for an 8-year-old girl staring right at me, waiting for something I wasn't sure I could give her. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what the real answer was. Adrian didn't save me from that moment. He didn't jump in. He didn't speak for me. He just sat there, silent, as if he understood that there are some questions each person has to answer for themselves, and no one can do it for them. Maya looked at me for another second, then gave a very slight nod. Not because she understood, but because she'd gotten her answer. My silence. She turned away, reached for her glass of milk, and took a small sip, as if she'd just finished a normal conversation. But I knew it wasn't normal, and for the first time since everything started falling apart that morning, I felt something worse than the pressure, worse than the control, worse than even losing everything I had built. I felt like I was standing in a place where I no longer knew what I was fighting to protect. And that made it impossible for me to answer a child. The truth doesn't arrive the way you think it will. It doesn't show up as a clear answer. It doesn't knock on your door. It doesn't introduce itself. It shows up in the things you've already seen, but weren't ready to understand yet. I wasn't planning on digging any deeper. After that morning, after Maya's question, I had enough to deal with, too much to control, too much that could collapse if I paused for more than a second. But there was one thing I couldn't do. I couldn't go back to how I was before. I couldn't keep believing that I understood things correctly. That afternoon, I was in my office, door closed, phone on silent, the screen in front of me displaying a list of documents I'd never thought I'd need to read before. Not reports, not contracts, but history. I started looking up the old names, not Adrian's, but the companies, the funds, the structures that existed before everything became so murky. And somewhere, buried deep in the old data, I found something I should have noticed sooner. A name. Not Adrian Locke. Another name. An older one, mentioned more than 10 years ago. An article in a financial magazine I'd read back in college, but back then it was just another success story, not something I needed to remember. I opened that article again. I read it once, then read it again, not because I didn't understand, but because I didn't want to understand it too quickly. A man built an investment fund from almost nothing, grew fast, too fast, fast enough to make people in the industry start paying attention. Then he disappeared. No announcement, no explanation. Never came back. He just left behind a system run by other people and a void that no one ever really filled. I looked at the picture, a younger face, cleaner cut, but it was unmistakable. Adrian. I sat there for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because everything started to click. The things he said, the decisions he made, the silences. It wasn't that he was hiding something. It was because he'd already left it all behind. I kept reading. The part I hadn't paid attention to before, the fine print, the details that weren't in bold, an event, an internal change, an incident that was never fully made public, the people closest to him, co-founders, family. They disappeared from the system right before he left. No big scandal, no trial. They just vanished, handled quietly. But it was enough to understand. It wasn't a simple decision. It wasn't an I don't want to do this anymore. It was an I can't continue in a system like that. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a second, and I opened it. And in that moment, a question surfaced, one that had nothing to do with Adrian. It was about my father. What did he know, and for how long? I didn't call. I didn't text. I went straight to his office, unannounced. His secretary looked at me, a little surprised, but didn't try to stop me. The door swung open. He was sitting there, same as always, behind his desk, everything around him neat, controlled, as if the world outside hadn't just been shaken to its core. He looked up. "You should have called first," he said. I didn't sit down. "Why him?" I asked, no beating around the bush, no preamble. He looked at me for a second. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You've been digging," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. "He used to have it all," I said. Then he lost it or walked away from it. A silence, very brief, but it was enough. "Why did you choose him?" I asked. This time he didn't answer right away. He looked down at his desk. Then he looked back up. "Because he was the only one who could do what needed to be done," he said. "Or because he's the only one you can't control?" I shot back. That question changed the air in the room, very slightly, but it was noticeable. He didn't deny it. That was enough. "You knew what happened to him," I said, my voice slower now. "You knew why he left." "I knew enough," he replied. "And you threw me in there anyway," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. That's just the truth. He looked at me. For a long time. You're already in it, he said. And you're still standing. That's not an answer, I said. It's the result, he replied. I was silent for a moment. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding from the start. What do you owe him? This time he didn't dodge it. I brought him into a system that I knew was dirty, he said. I didn't stop it when I could have. I felt my fists tighten. You knew he would be betrayed, I said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. And now you're using me to fix it? I asked. He shook his head, just slightly. I'm using you to save what can still be saved, he said. That didn't make me feel any better. It made everything clearer. It wasn't because he didn't understand the consequences. It was because he had accepted them. I stood there, without saying another word. There was no need. That was enough. When I left his office, I didn't feel angry. Not anymore. Just a very strange feeling. Like you've just taken off a pair of glasses you've worn for too long, and now everything is sharper but also colder. For the first time, I didn't see Adrian as an enigma. I saw him as someone who had already been through everything I was just beginning to touch. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if he was the one I should be wary of, or if it was the system I had trusted my entire life. There are moments when everything becomes very simple. Not because the situation is easy, but because there's no way to complicate it any further. I sat in my car, engine off, my hands still on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead but not really seeing the road. And for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to find a solution. No spreadsheets, no scenarios, no optimal strategies, just two paths, and they both came with a price. My phone was on the seat next to me. The screen lit up, then went dark, over and over, notifications piling on top of each other. Shareholders demanding a response, lawyers needing a decision, the media waiting for an official statement, and I knew that with just one call, one perfectly timed sentence, I could pull everything back onto the track I was trained to control. That was the world I understood, a world where everything could be negotiated, restructured, salvaged if you were fast enough and cold enough. I stared at the phone, but I didn't touch it. Another image surfaced in my mind, not a boardroom, not a spreadsheet, but that morning. Maya, sitting at the dining table, hands wrapped around a glass of milk, looking right at me with a question I couldn't answer. Not because it was difficult, but because it was real. I leaned my head back against the seat. I closed my eyes for a second, and in that moment, I realized something I'd never allowed myself to even consider before. I wasn't being forced to choose. I had just gotten used to not choosing. The difference was subtle. It changed everything. I opened my eyes. I picked up at the phone. My contacts were already open. My father's name was at the top. Just one tap. Everything would go back to its proper place, on the surface at least. I stared at the name for a long time. Then I scrolled down. I didn't delete it, just scrolled past it. I looked for another number. It had no name. Just a string of digits I'd seen in the files earlier. I hadn't saved it. Didn't want it to become part of the old system. I hit call. It rang. Once, twice, a third time. I wasn't sure I wanted him to pick up, but he did. Yeah, Adrian said, his voice the same as always. No questions, no surprise. I didn't speak right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly. I spoke to my father, I said. There was a faint pause on the other end of the line. Not long, but long enough for you to understand. He knows, I continued. He knows everything. I figured, Adrian replied. No blame, no more questions, just acceptance. I gripped the phone a little tighter. I was wrong, I said. For the first time, those words left my mouth without any conditions attached. No buts, no explanations, just a fact. On the other end of the line, there was no immediate reaction. No, I told you so. No fake relief, just silence. And in that silence, I understood something. You didn't need me to say it. You just needed me to understand. I don't know if I can fix all of this, I said slowly. But I know if I keep going down this path then, even if I manage to keep everything, it won't be worth keeping anymore. I paused, took a breath, and went on. I'm not going to side with them. The words weren't loud, not forceful. But it was the first time I had made a decision that wasn't based on anyone else's expectations. A longer silence this time. Then Adrian spoke. "Are you sure?" It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't doubt. Just a question to make sure I understood the cost. I looked ahead. The road was the same. The city was the same. But I wasn't seeing it the same way anymore. "No," I said. "I'm not sure." A beat. But this is the first time I'm not choosing because I'm sure, but because I know I have to. On the other end of the line, I heard a very soft breath. Not relief, not tension, just real. "Okay," he said, "just one word, no promises, no protection, no rescue." And that, in a strange way, made me feel more grounded than any promise could have. I hung up, sat in silence for a few more seconds. Then I started the car. When I walked into the house, Maya was in the living room, sitting on the floor with a book open in front of her, but not really reading. Like she was waiting for something she didn't have a name for yet. She looked up at the sound of the door. She didn't ask anything right away. Just watched. I stood there for a second. Then I walked over to her and sat down on her level. This time, I didn't try to find the right answer. I just said what I knew. "We might be in trouble," I said. Maya blinked, not scared, just listening. "But this time," I continued, "we're not going to pretend anymore." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, very slightly, as if that was the only thing she needed to hear. I sat there, on the floor, in the house I used to think was temporary, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was getting ready to leave. It wasn't because everything was okay. It was because I had chosen to stay. I didn't have much time. Then you're standing in the middle of a system being pulled in different directions. You don't have the luxury of waiting for clarity. You just have to act on what you know and accept that some of it might be wrong. I got back to work that same night, not my office. The dining table, laptop open, documents spread across the surface. My phone was on silent, but I could still feel every vibration, like an external heartbeat I was choosing to ignore for now. I started with Leonard. Not the man himself, but the way he operated, his past deals, the companies he'd targeted, the structures he used to pressure an organization from the inside. The pattern emerged very quickly. He doesn't break things from the outside. He creates a choke point within, a shareholder large enough to slow every decision, yet small enough to go unnoticed at first. Then he uses media and legal pressure to force the rest of the system to tear itself apart. I looked at the list of shareholders. Not all of them, just the ones who could be leveraged. One name stood out, not big, not prominent, but a perfect fit. A mid-level shareholder holding a stake just large enough to create a bottleneck if pushed into the right position. I pulled up his file. I read it quickly. Then I read it again, slowly. Not because I didn't understand, but because one detail didn't fit. A side investment, not directly related, but enough to create pressure if someone knew how to use it. I sat up straight. If Leonard was targeting this guy, then I could get there first, not to buy him out, but to lock him down. I picked up my phone and made the call. No small talk, no lengthy introduction. I got straight to the point. I didn't try to persuade him. I didn't threaten him. I gave him an option. A way for him to keep most of what he had, instead of losing everything when the system comes crashing down. On the other end of the line, he was silent for a long time. I didn't push, didn't add anything. I just waited. Finally, he spoke. "I need time." I glanced at my watch. "I don't have much," I replied. The call ended without a commitment. No deal, just a possibility. I put the phone down, stared at the screen, and for the first time that night, I felt like I might have made the wrong move. If I misjudged this man, if he was already leaning toward Leonard, then I had just put myself in the weakest possible position. I closed my eyes for a second. Not for long, but long enough to feel the difference. Between being in control and making a gamble, the phone buzzed. This time, I looked. It wasn't an unknown number. It was Adrian. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "You're on the right track," he said immediately. No questions, no preamble, just a statement. I didn't ask how he knew. "I could be wrong," I said. "You could be," he replied. No denial, no reassurance, just the truth. "Then why did you call?" I asked. A very short pause. Because you're at a point where one small decision will change the outcome, he said. I looked back at the file on the screen. He doesn't care about the company, I said slowly. He cares about the side investment. Exactly, Adrian said. Nothing more. No explanation. Just confirmation. I understood. It wasn't that I needed more information. I needed to be sure I was looking at the right thing. I'm going to call him back, I said. Okay, Adrian replied. No instructions. No instructions. I hang up and call back. This time, I don't talk about the company. I don't talk about the shareholders. I talk about the side investment, how it could be affected, how it could get dragged into this if he picks the wrong side. And this time, I hear the shift. It's not big, but it's there. The sound of a man starting to understand that the real risk isn't where he's been looking. It's where he hasn't. I won't sell, he finally says. I don't breathe a sigh of relief. Not yet, but I'm not siding with you either, he adds. I don't need you to, I reply. I just need you not to side with him. A pause. Then he nods. Even though I can't see it. The call ends. I put the phone down and stare at my screen. The lines of data are still there. But this time, they don't feel so fragmented. One anchor point has held. One knot hasn't been pulled tight. But the system isn't stable, not even close. My phone buzzes again. A news alert. An article has been edited. An allegation has been retracted. Not the whole thing, but enough to slow the momentum. I lean back in my chair. It's not a win. Not yet, but it's not a loss. And sometimes in a system like this, that's the only difference between survival and collapse. I look down at my hands. They aren't shaking. But they aren't completely steady either. And for the first time, I realized something. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was leading, not because I was certain, but because I had chosen not to stand still anymore. 3 months later, things didn't go back to the way they were. And that, in a very clear way, was the one thing that made it right. I don't sit in the old office anymore. The big desk, the glass walls, the long meetings where people said a lot but rarely said the truth. It was all still there. There just wasn't a place for me anymore, not because I was pushed out, but because I stepped away first. The decision wasn't loud. There was no big argument. There wasn't some dramatic moment where everything shattered. Just a series of shorter meetings, longer glances, more carefully chosen words, and then one day I signed a different document, not a marriage certificate, but transition papers, handing control back to a board I knew would operate the way it always had. My father didn't stop me. He didn't try to keep me, either. He just looked at me once, longer than usual, as if he was trying to understand something he'd never had to understand before. We didn't talk about my choice. We didn't need to. Some gaps aren't created by words, and so they can't be filled by them either. I didn't lose everything, but I lost enough. Enough to know I had paid a price, and enough that I could never go back to how things were. The house hasn't changed. The door is still painted blue. The paint in the bottom corner is still peeling slightly in a spot. Adrian said he'd fix, but never did. And the wind chimes on the porch still make those tiny sounds whenever the wind passes through. Not loud enough to be noticed, but just enough that you hear them when you stand still long enough. The mornings still start with coffee. Not always on time, not always perfect, but it's always there. Maya's a little older. In that way, kids get older. Quietly, without any announcement. It's just that one day you realize she's stopped asking the same questions and has started making observations you don't know how to answer. Adrian still works. Not the job the world knows, but the one he chose. 3 days a week, he leaves the house early, wearing that old shirt, and comes back smelling of metal and machine oil, with small stories about things he's fixed. Things that seem insignificant, but are enough to make a day feel whole. He didn't go back. Didn't step back into those rooms where I'd seen him stand, where all eyes were on him, where every decision carried weight. He could have. I know that. But he didn't. It wasn't because he couldn't anymore. It was because he no longer needed to. One weekend afternoon, I drove past the old office district. No particular reason, just a habit that hadn't faded yet. I stopped at a red light, looking up at the glass building, reflecting the sky, the place where I once thought I'd stay longer, climb higher, and be, in some way, more important. Didn't feel any regret, not entirely. Just a tiny empty space, enough to remind me that another version of myself once existed, and now she's gone. The light turned green. I drove on, without looking back. That evening, I got home later than usual. The kitchen light was still on. Maya was sitting on the floor, painting something, the watercolors bleeding outside the lines, just like always. Adrian was standing at the sink, his back to the door, just like the first day I walked into this place. Everything looked so similar, but it wasn't the same. Maya looked up at the sound of the door. She didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just looked, as if she were confirming something she already knew. I walked in, put my bag down, and sat on the floor next to her. "What are you painting?" I asked. "A house," Maya said. I looked at the painting. 3 people. A child. 2 adults. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were off, but they were standing close together. I didn't correct her, didn't try to fix it. I just looked. Maya looked up. "You're going to stay, right?" she asked. It wasn't a question like before. There was no doubt in her voice. It was just confirmation. I looked at her for a moment. Then I nodded. "Yeah," I said. She nodded back, as if that was all she needed to know. Adrian turned around just then. His eyes rested on me for a moment. He didn't ask, didn't check, just looking, as if he was also confirming something that didn't need to be said out loud. I stood up, walked closer, and stood beside him, not touching him, but not keeping the same distance as before. Outside on the porch, a gentle breeze was blowing. The wind chimes tinkled, a sound so soft it was almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. But if you stood still, if you weren't trying to do anything else, you could hear it, very clearly. I looked out through the window, into the darkness ahead, where nothing was predefined, no path was laid out, and no outcome was guaranteed. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. Not because everything was okay, but because I had chosen to stay, not because I was forced to, but because I wanted to. And sometimes, a life isn't built from scratch. It's chosen, piece by piece. If you've stayed with me this long, then maybe you've also sensed the things this story doesn't say directly. Not everyone gets the chance to choose their life from the very beginning. Sometimes, we start down a path we didn't decide on, carrying things we didn't create, and believing that's the only way for things to continue. But then there comes a moment, a very small one, where everything pauses just long enough for you to realize you can still choose. Not to choose what's easy, not to choose what's safe, but to choose what's right for yourself. This story isn't perfect, and maybe it doesn't have to be. Because the things that truly matter are rarely perfect in the way we expect. If you saw a part of yourself somewhere in this story, even in the smallest detail, then perhaps that's why you stayed until the end. Thank you for your time. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories not just to be listened to, but to be felt, you can come back anytime. We'll still be here.